The sea was a hard blue plain on June 4, 1944, 1,109 hours, about 150 miles west of Rio de Oro off French West Africa. Aboard the destroyer escort Chatelaine, Lieutenant Commander Means Johnston pressed his headphones tight, chasing a faint metallic echo that rose through the Atlantic. The contact was impossibly close, 800 yards, so close that standard depth charges would barely arm before they fell past the target. Training said attack and finish the kill without delay. The sound in his ears said something else. It said a door was cracking open. High on the bridge of the escort carrier Guadalcanal, Task Group 22.3 cut a clean wake under the sun. Captain Daniel V. Gallery, a broad-shouldered Chicagoan who once wrestled in the Olympics, watched the destroyers edge inward. He had already put 3 German boats down in the last few months. Each time he had seen the same sickening sight as the enemy slipped under. Codebooks and charts gone to water. Machines that could have spoken swallowed by depth and silence. That waste had gnawed at him until an idea took root that did not belong in any manual. For 3 weeks he had turned that idea into muscle memory. Volunteers from every ship drilled until their knuckles bled, learning the innards of a German submarine from captured diagrams and hard-won notes. They memorized valves by touch, the color of wires in low light, the paths to scuttling charges hidden behind panels and piping. They packed waterproof document bags and canvas patches and portable pumps, and endured the looks that said their captain was a romantic courting disaster. Gallery said little. He let the repetitions hammer away doubt until only readiness remained. Under the surface, the German submarine U-505 crept on batteries. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See Harold Lang, 40 years old and methodical, had been given a poison chalice. The boat had a reputation for bad luck. Equipment failed at the worst moments. On a prior patrol, the former captain had put a pistol to his head in a storm of depth charges, a story that rode every bunk and mess table like a restless ghost. Lang had done what leaders do when machines and morale sag. He worked the crew hard, coaxed the boat through overhaul, and tried to set a rhythm that would drown the superstition. Yet the Atlantic had a way of finding weaknesses, and on this run the crew had low batteries and bulky detection gear. They had no idea they had sailed into the middle of an American hunter-killer group that specialized in patiently tightening circles. Chatelaine fired first. A spread of hedgehog projectiles arced out and fell in a ring, then held their breath in the water. Hedgehogs did not boom on their own like depth charges. They waited for contact. A heartbeat. Another. Then sharp cracks pulsed up through the hulls of the escorts. Direct hits. Shallow depth charges followed, set to catch a boat forced near the surface. Inside U-505 the world snapped apart. Men crashed into consoles and bulkheads. Gauges shattered. The bow pitched upward and the rudder jammed hard over, locking the boat into a slow circling climb she could not control. High-pressure lines split and spat oily spray. The noise was a hammer that found the center of the skull with every blow. A machinist stared at the depth gauge as the needle spun like a compass gone crazy. There was nothing to do but ride the boat upward and hope the hull would hold. At 11:16, the submarine burst through the skin of the sea. She was less than 600 yards from Chatelaine, her deck awash, her rudder still biting right, tracing wide circles like a wounded shark. Lang chose survival over ceremony. He gave the order to abandon ship and to set demolition charges and open the sea valves. Bullets from American guns stitched the water. Aircraft from the carrier screamed down and raked the roiling foam with heavy fire. In the din and the spray, demolition procedures were mangled by fear and speed. Some charges were placed but not armed. Valves were opened but left unsecured. Papers went overboard in bundles and handfuls, yet the most sensitive material still lay on desks and in drawers below. On the bridge of Guadalcanal, Gallery finally saw the chance he had imagined in sleepless stretches of the last months. The enemy boat was not dead. She was wounded and unguarded, still turning under a live sky. He grabbed the radio and spoke words the United States Navy had not used in over a century. Away all boarding parties. Board and take that submarine. It was an order that cracked against every habit the war had pressed into sailors since the first shot was fired. On the destroyer escort Pillsbury, a whaleboat slapped down into the chop. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert Leroy David stood in its bow with 8 men and the kind of quiet that comes from long service. He had joined the Navy in 1919 and climbed one rung at a time until he wore an officer's stripe. He knew German doctrine. He knew scuttling charges were seeded through a U-boat like teeth, and if even one sat armed and waiting, a boarding party could be erased in a white flash and a roar. That knowledge did not slow his hands as he checked his men's lines and the coil of a grapnel on the deck. The sea lifted the whaleboat and dropped it and lifted it again. The submarine yawed ahead at 5 or 6 knots, the jammed rudder dragging her into slow circles. There were no German hands left on deck to throw a line or dog a hatch. The only way aboard was to time the approach to a moving wall of wet steel, jump, and trust the friction of boots and the grip of a glove. David made the decision the instant the hull rolled toward him. He went first. He planted on the slick deck and sprinted for the conning tower as the boat he had just left fell away behind him. 2 men followed in a blur while the rest wrestled the whaleboat into a tenuous hold beside a vessel that did not want company. David dropped through the hatch into heat and darkness. The emergency lights were out. The air was thick with diesel, battery acid, fear, and something metallic that rode the back of the tongue. Water rolled ankle-deep across the control room, and the tilt of the deck made every motion a stumble. Somewhere in the maze of steel, demolition clocks might be ticking. He could not hear them over the hiss of air and the distant thud of pumps and engines that refused to die. He pressed an ear to a closed door, listening for the rush that would mean opening it would drown them. He spun the wheel. The door groaned. The forward compartment held. A sea strainer roared like a waterfall. With torpedo man Arthur Nispel bracing against the angle and the slop underfoot, he cranked the big valve until the flow fell from a torrent to a strong stream. It was not salvation yet, but it was a beginning. Up in the radio room, a radio man's flashlight swept across a table and stopped. An Enigma machine sat in place with rotors fitted. Codebooks lay open to the date. Coordinate tables rested nearby, meant to shift with the turn of the calendar to keep prying eyes blind. The chaos on deck had not reached this small kingdom of paper and Bakelite in time. The radio man worked with shaking hands, packing the hull into the waterproof bags that Gallery had insisted were standard kit, the kind of foresight that had drawn smirks during drill and now looked like prophecy. On the carrier's bridge, Gallery watched the destroyers carve circles around a prize that might yet find a way to die. He had not just picked a fight with an enemy submarine. He had picked a fight with tradition and with the anger he knew would blaze in Washington if the enemy guessed what had been taken. None of that mattered if the men inside that steel tube could keep it afloat and if the ocean did not decide otherwise. The Atlantic rolled and glittered as if nothing much was happening at all. The smoke and spray and the quick splashes of spent shells were small marks on a wide canvas. The whaleboat bumped and scraped. Lines creaked. Somewhere below, a single charge that had been set but not yet found waited in the heat and the dark, silent and patient, giving nothing away. The chapter closes as Gallery's order still hangs in the air, as the boarding party pushes deeper into the hull with their lights and tools, as pumps clatter to life and the battered submarine keeps turning her slow circles under the sun. Inside the wounded submarine, heat and noise wrapped around Lieutenant Albert David and his men like a living thing. Every step echoed with a hollow clang, followed by the whisper of water sloshing through narrow corridors. The light from their flash lamps cut through the darkness in thin trembling beams, bouncing off riveted steel and tangled cables. The air was thick, almost wet, with the smell of diesel oil and scorched insulation. Somewhere aft, an engine coughed itself into silence. David steadied himself against a bulkhead and called out. His voice came back smaller, swallowed by the hum of machinery still trying to run. The men were working half-blind, every turn of a valve or lever an act of faith. In the cramped passageway, radioman Stanley Widziwak stumbled over a fallen wrench and muttered a curse that no one answered. There was no space for talk here. Only the measured sound of breathing and the distant drip of water. Above them, the ocean pressed down with a weight that could bend metal. Each creak of the hull felt like the slow sigh of something waking up. The submarine still had power, enough to keep the electric motors turning the propeller shafts and pushing her in her endless circle. It made the whole structure tremble, like a heartbeat running under the deck plates. The danger was not just drowning. Any spark, any wrong switch, could set off the scuttling charges that had been planted but never triggered. David knew it. His men knew it. They moved as if the air itself might explode. They reached the control room where gauges flickered dimly, some shattered, others still trembling between numbers. On the wall, a clock had stopped at 11:17. Time seemed to have paused in that minute of chaos when the Germans had fled. Papers floated in puddles, corners burned from emergency lamps. David bent to pick one up and saw German text smeared with oil. He slipped it into a pouch without thinking. Every scrap might matter. "Sea strainer closed," shouted Nispel from the forward hatch. "Flooding slowing down." "Good," David replied. "Keep the pumps running if you can." They could not tell if the words carried through the noise. It didn't matter. The rhythm of work kept them steady. A sound came from behind them, faint but distinct, a metallic clank like a door hinge. Instinct froze them all. David swung his flashlight toward the source. A figure stood in the half-light, soaked and trembling. It was a German sailor, young, barely more than a boy. His hands were empty and raised, eyes wide with the kind of fear that sees everything and understands nothing. For a moment no one moved. Then the sailor pointed downward toward a valve wheel and said something in broken English. "Closed, closed good, no sink." They stared. It took a second for the words to register. He was the one who had shut the critical valves before abandoning ship. David nodded once. "Danke," he said softly. The boy bolted past them and up through the hatch into daylight, toward captivity and survival. The men went back to work. In the radio room, Witziwack's beam caught a gleam of brass on the desk. The Enigma machine. Its keys were slick with condensation, its rotors still in place, numbers visible through the small glass windows. Around it, codebooks lay open, their pages rippling like the surface of a pond. He reached out, careful not to disturb the layout, and began packing everything into the waterproof bag that hung at his side. His hands shook so badly he had to clench them first to make them obey. Back in the engine room, 2 more sailors from Pillsbury arrived with portable pumps and cables. They set the pumps running, the hoses coughing seawater back into the Atlantic. Steam rose in thin white veils that made the flashlights glow like candles. Commander Earl Trocino, Guadalcanal's chief engineer, arrived next, soaked from spray and shouting over the roar. Within minutes he had ordered the diesels decoupled from the electric motors, turning the boat's propellers into makeshift generators as the carrier began towing her slowly west. The ingenuity of it struck David even through the exhaustion. They were using the submarine's own muscles to keep her alive. Above, the sun dipped lower. The ocean flattened into sheets of bronze and silver as Task Group 22.3 formed a protective ring. On Guadalcanal's bridge, Captain Gallery watched the tow line tighten and the submarine begin her reluctant journey. He knew the real battle had only begun. Word of this capture could not reach enemy ears. If Germany learned that U-505 had been taken, they would change every code in the book and weeks of Allied planning would crumble before the Normandy invasion. Silence was the only shield that could protect what these men had risked everything to win. Night came down over the convoy. The destroyers ran dark, their navigation lights blacked out, their radios whispering only in code. Below decks, David's men kept the pumps going until their arms gave out. The water level dropped inch by inch. Each new valve closed was another small victory against the Atlantic. When dawn broke, U-505 was still afloat, riding in the wake of her captors. On the second morning, David leaned against the conning tower and looked out across the wide horizon. Behind him, the submarine still groaned but held together. The flag of the United States fluttered from her periscope mast, a sight no sailor had ever seen before. He thought of the men below, of the German sailor who had stayed long enough to save them all, of Gallery's impossible order, and of the thin line between obedience and courage. Far astern, the carrier gleamed in the early light, and the Atlantic stretched on forever. The mission was not over. It had only changed shape from battle to secret. The captured boat had to vanish before the world noticed she was missing. And so the convoy turned westward, engines low, a ghost fleet carrying a silent prize. 2 days after the capture, The Atlantic seemed calm, but everyone aboard knew that the silence was fragile. U-5, stripped of her German flag and painted hastily with dull gray American markings, rode low in the water behind the carrier Guadalcanal. Her metal skin creaked as waves slapped against it, a constant reminder that she was still alive, still foreign, still dangerous. Captain Daniel Gallery paced the bridge with a cigarette burning between his fingers, the smoke twisting away in the wind. Below, the crew of the carrier and her escorts went about their duties as if they had not just pulled off the most daring seizure in the history of the American Navy. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. If word of the capture leaked, the Germans would change their ciphers overnight, and every secret gained from the Enigma machine would turn to dust. Gallery's voice had been firm when he briefed the officers that morning. "This is no victory we can celebrate. It's a secret we have to bury until the war is over." The sailors understood. Mail was censored. Radios were locked down to short-coded bursts. They were ghosts now, towing another ghost across 2,500 miles of ocean. Below deck inside the captured submarine, the air still smelled of oil and fear. Pumps groaned, hoses hissed, and water trickled endlessly into buckets that were carried out and dumped overboard. Lieutenant Albert David slept in short bursts on a narrow bunk, his boots still on, his head against a bulkhead that vibrated with the throb of engines. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the flickering light inside the control room, the gleam of the Enigma machine, and the look on that young German sailor's face. He knew he'd stepped into something far bigger than himself, something that would ripple far beyond this voyage. At noon, Gallery joined Commander Earl Trocino on deck to inspect the towing setup. The heavy cable stretched like a silver spear through the wake. "She's holding better than I expected," Trocino said, wiping salt from his brow. "Engines are cold but the motors are turning, charging the batteries. Pumps are steady. We can keep her afloat." Gallery nodded but didn't smile. "Let's hope she doesn't decide to blow herself up halfway home." He wasn't joking. The boarding parties had found 14 demolition charges scattered through the submarine, one of them still armed. Its timer had jammed, a twist of luck so fine it made Gallery's skin crawl. He had ordered it disarmed personally, standing beside the Navy's ordnance men as they removed the detonator. He could still smell the sharp bite of burnt powder in the confined air when he thought about it. That night, under a field of stars, the convoy moved without running lights. The ocean stretched in every direction, black and infinite. On the horizon, faint lightning flickered like ghosts of battle. David stood on the conning tower of the U-boat, his hands gripping the rail. The captured vessel now towed behind her enemy like a wounded animal on a leash. He could hear music drifting faintly from the carrier. Someone had smuggled a phonograph onto the deck. A slow jazz tune floated across the water. For the first time in days, the sound made him breathe easier. But secrecy had its price. On board, sailors were forbidden to write about what had happened. No letters, no diary notes, not even coded hints. One careless word could undo everything. The crew of the U-boat, 58 German sailors pulled from the sea, were held under guard in silence. They were told they were going to Casablanca, though that was a lie. They would end up in Louisiana, buried in isolation so deep that even their families would believe them dead. The war allowed no space for truth, only what was necessary to win. On the 10th day, as the fleet neared Bermuda, the first storm hit. Wind screamed through the rigging, waves rose like hills, and the tow line strained until it sang. The captured submarine pitched and rolled violently. Pumps flooded, lights flickered, and men scrambled to keep her steady. In the storm's heart, Gallery's voice came over the intercom, calm and unshakable. "No one lets go of that line. That boat is coming home, even if the Atlantic tries to take her back." For 16 hours they fought the sea. Rain lashed like whips, salt spray filled every seam, and the horizon vanished behind a gray wall. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed. The tow line still held. The submarine still floated. That night, as the waves settled to a whisper, Gallery stood alone at the rail. He thought of the German crew huddled in silence, of David and his men working in darkness, of the codebooks drying in sealed bags below. He thought of the admirals back in Washington who would call him reckless, perhaps even insubordinate. And yet he knew, deep down, that this act of defiance might change the course of the war. Far behind, the captured submarine glimmered faintly in the moonlight, trailing a thin line of foam. To the sea and the stars, she was just another vessel moving home. But to Gallery and his men, she was something else entirely, proof that even in war, sometimes courage meant disobedience. The Atlantic lay quiet again, as if holding its breath for what would come next. The convoy reached Bermuda on June 19, 1944. The sea was calm again, a mirror of blue and silver, as the battered U-505 slid into the sheltered naval basin behind the carrier Guadalcanal. Her steel hull was pitted, her paint scarred, her deck still streaked with oil and salt. But she was alive and she was whole. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge, his face unreadable. Around him, sailors cheered quietly under their breath, too disciplined to shout, but unable to hide the pride in their eyes. No one had ever done what they had just done. They had captured an enemy submarine intact, complete with her codebooks, weapons, and secrets. The celebration lasted minutes. Then came the silence. Gallery ordered every man in Task Group 22.3 to assemble on the flight deck. The morning sun burned through a thin mist as 3,000 sailors stood in formation. He spoke plainly, his voice carrying across the deck and the still water beyond. Men, what you did out there will live in history. But history can't know it yet. Not today. Not this year. Maybe not even this decade. From this moment on, this operation does not exist. He paused. The wind tugged at his cap. Until you're told otherwise, you say nothing. To anyone. Not your wives. Not your families. Not even your shipmates who weren't here. If you break this silence, you risk lives. You risk the war. There was no applause. Only the sound of waves against the hull. The men understood. The victory they had earned was one they could never talk about. The secrecy order was absolute. All mail from the task group was intercepted and censored. Letters home arrived with whole pages blacked out. Shore leave was cancelled. Every sailor signed a statement acknowledging that any mention of the capture could lead to court-martial. The official records of the engagement were rewritten to say that U-505 had been destroyed at sea. The German prisoners, 58 of them, were loaded onto a transport ship that sailed not to Casablanca, as they had been told, but to a special camp in Louisiana. They were separated from all other prisoners of war, housed behind double fences topped with barbed wire, guarded by Navy personnel who spoke no German. Their names were withheld from the Red Cross. Their families received telegrams saying they were missing in action, presumed dead. Inside the submarine, teams of intelligence officers worked in total secrecy. The codebooks were dried carefully, each page pressed between layers of absorbent cloth. The Enigma machine was disassembled, packed, and flown under guard to England. At Bletchley Park, British and American codebreakers gathered around the machine like surgeons around a patient. The rotors still bore the daily key settings for early June, the week before D-Day. The timing could not have been more critical. In the humid Bermuda air, naval engineers studied the captured vessel from bow to stern. They photographed every valve, every circuit, every torpedo mechanism. They sketched the battery compartments and the snorkel system, marveling at the German ingenuity. It was as if they were dissecting a living creature to understand how it breathed and hunted. But for Gallery, the victory turned sour as soon as Washington learned of his disobedient act. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, was furious. He called Gallery's decision reckless, accused him of endangering Ultra, the top-secret Allied code-breaking program. If the Germans find out we've taken one of their boats, King thundered in his message, they'll change every system we've cracked. You might as well hand them victory on a silver plate. There was talk of a court-martial. Gallery's commanding officers debated for days whether he should be stripped of command. The British, too, were furious. They had captured German submarines before, in 1941 and 42, but had always kept it secret, scuttling the boats to hide the evidence. To them, Gallery's decision to tow U-505 across the Atlantic was nothing short of madness. But the secret held. Weeks passed. The Germans never learned what had happened. U-505 was listed in their naval records as lost with all hands in the Atlantic. Her commander, Harold Lang, was recorded as missing, presumed dead. And so, what might have been a scandal quietly turned into a miracle. The intelligence gathered from the submarine's documents helped the Allies reroute convoys away from Wolfpack patrol zones with uncanny precision. The acoustic torpedo found on deck led to countermeasures that saved hundreds of ships. The Enigma settings confirmed British code-breaking theories and gave the Allies confidence just days before the Normandy invasion. Lieutenant Albert David was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He never spoke of what he had done. When the medal was awarded, it was presented quietly, almost secretly. He would not live to see its full recognition. A year later, at 43, he died of a heart attack. The captured submarine, now under heavy guard, was repainted and renamed the USS Nemo for secrecy's sake. She would remain hidden for months, her presence known only to a handful of officers. At night, when the island was quiet, Gallery sometimes walked down to the dock where the captured boat was moored. He would stand there in the moonlight, looking at the black silhouette against the still water. He could almost hear the ocean again, the ping of sonar, the crack of explosions, the echo of a decision that had changed everything. No one else knew what he knew. The cost of silence was heavy, but the reward was heavier. The submarine that should have been destroyed was alive. And with her, a secret that would tilt the balance of the war. In the summer heat of 1944, far from the Atlantic and the noise of war, the crew of the captured German submarine stepped onto American soil for the first time. Their boots sank into the dry dust of Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a prisoner-of-war camp built for thousands of soldiers, but never for ghosts. The 58 survivors of U-505 were separated immediately from the other German prisoners. Guards led them through a gate within a gate, a smaller compound fenced twice, topped with extra strands of barbed wire that gleamed in the sun. A sign read, "Restricted Area," though even the camp's commandant didn't know why these men were treated differently. The sailors were silent as they entered their new world. No Red Cross officials greeted them. No mail arrived. No news of families, no word from Germany. To everyone back home, they were already dead. Weeks passed. The months. The silence became a weight that pressed down harder than the Louisiana humidity. Letters never came. Birthdays went unnoticed. Some of the prisoners began to believe that they were not prisoners at all, but shades in some afterlife built of wood barracks, fences, and heat. Machinist Hans Gobeler, the same man who had watched the submarine's uncontrolled ascent that morning in June, wrote years later that they felt like men who had been erased. He said, "We could hear other Germans in the main camp laughing, singing, receiving mail. But we got nothing. We were ghosts, neither dead nor alive." Every conversation was overheard. The Americans had hidden microphones in the walls, and intelligence officers disguised as fellow prisoners moved among them, listening for details about German technology or U-boat operations. Even the prisoners' notebooks were seized, their chess games monitored for hidden messages. The Germans could not understand why their captors seemed more interested in the layout of their submarine than in their rank or service. Their commander, Harold Lang, was kept apart from the others. His leg had been wounded during the attack, and he was sent to the base hospital under guard. Nurses treated him without speaking. No letters, no radio, no human contact except for the doctor who changed his bandages. For 6 months he lived in a world of whispers and silence, believing he was the only survivor. He later wrote that he had considered ending his life there, in that quiet room behind locked doors. But one night, an American officer entered, not as a guard, but as a messenger. He told Lang that his men were alive, that they were all together in the same camp. Lang wept openly, the first tears he had shed since the capture. His relief turned to cooperation. He began answering questions about sonar systems, torpedo technology, radio encryption, not as a prisoner, but as an engineer who wanted his men to live through the war. Meanwhile, behind the double fences, the crew built a strange new world to survive the endless isolation. They taught classes to each other: mathematics, mechanics, English. They built an orchestra from scrap wood and Red Cross packaging, fashioning violins and flutes from whatever they could find. They even published a small handwritten newspaper passed secretly between barracks, filled with jokes, stories, and sketches. One drawing showed a skeleton in a U-boat uniform, leaning on a fence and holding a letter that would never arrive. Beneath it, in crooked letters, someone had written, "Still waiting for mail from home." The Americans monitoring the camp noticed the humor, but they also saw the despair creeping through the lines of every joke. 3 sailors attempted suicide. Others simply stopped eating for days at a time. The guards began allowing them to tend a small garden, just to give them purpose. At night, when the air cooled and the cicadas sang beyond the wire, the prisoners lay awake listening to the sounds of a country they didn't understand. The faint music from radios outside the fence. The whistle of trains in the distance. The low murmur of guards telling stories in English. It felt like another planet. For the Americans, these 58 men were not just prisoners, they were living secrets. Their very existence was a classified operation. The United States Navy could not risk word of the capture reaching Germany. So the men of U-505 disappeared, buried in bureaucracy and silence, while the war thundered on across oceans they would never see again. And somewhere in the still night of Louisiana, Commander Harold Lang sat at a small wooden desk and began writing in a notebook the Americans didn't know about. His memories of the sea, of the explosion, of the choice he made to surface rather than let his crew die. He wrote not for intelligence officers, but for himself, to remember who he was before he became a ghost. The moon hung low over the fences, the guards' lanterns flickered, and the night insects buzzed like static in the air. The camp slept. The war moved on. But the secret of U-505, and the men trapped inside that secret, remained sealed away from the world. 20 years later, the war was a memory written into textbooks and memorial plaques. The submarine that once haunted the Atlantic now sat beneath a different sky, Chicago's. At the Museum of Science and Industry, U-505 rested quietly on her concrete cradle, her metal skin weathered, her story half forgotten by the public and half hidden by secrecy. In 1964, retired Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery stood in front of the submarine that had defined his career. He was older now, white-haired, his once broad wrestler's shoulders slightly bent with age, but the spark in his eyes was still there. Around him, reporters gathered for the 20th anniversary of the capture. The museum planned a special ceremony. Gallery had arranged something even more unexpected. He had invited an old enemy. Through the help of German naval veterans associations, he had tracked down the former commander of U-505, Harold Lang. For months, Gallery had written letters to him in Hamburg. The first went unanswered. The second too. The third came back with a short note. "The memories are too heavy. I cannot come." But Gallery was not the kind of man who took silence as a final answer. His fourth letter was simple. "You saved your men. That's what I remember. Not defeat, but life. Come see what your boat has become." Lang arrived that summer. The reporters didn't recognize him at first. He was quiet, formal, his uniform long replaced by the plain clothes of a harbor pilot. When he stepped onto the museum grounds and saw the massive submarine resting in her exhibit trench, he stopped walking. His face went pale. "It looks smaller," he said softly in accented English. "Smaller than I remember." Gallery walked beside him in silence. The 2 men, one who had captured, the other who had surrendered, descended the narrow gangway into the submarine's dim interior. The air still smelled faintly of oil and metal, as if time had stood still. Lang ran his fingers over the cold steel of the bulkhead and closed his eyes. "I can hear them," he whispered. "My crew. I can still hear their voices." In a small ceremony held below deck, the 2 men faced each other. Gallery reached into a leather satchel and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Lang. Inside was a pair of binoculars, the same ones taken from the U-boat's bridge 20 years earlier. "These belong to you," Gallery said. "I kept them all these years. I think they've seen enough." Lang stared at them for a long time before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought I had failed. But maybe it was the right kind of failure." Then Gallery handed him something else, a small, water-stained diary. "We found this hidden behind a pipe in your cabin," he said. "I read it. Every word. It helped me understand you were not monsters. Just men doing your duty." Lang's hands shook as he opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, his own. He read aloud, his voice trembling. "We have been at sea for 40 days. The men are breaking down. Perhaps we are already dead, waiting for the ocean to claim us." For a moment, there was only the hum of the museum's lights and the muffled footsteps of visitors above. Then Lang closed the diary and looked at Gallery with wet eyes. "We were enemies," he said. "Now we are simply survivors." The two men shook hands. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, but neither man seemed to notice. They were caught between the past and the present, between war and peace. That evening, they stood together outside, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The water was calm, glowing gold and red. Lang spoke again almost to himself. "I could have gone down with my boat, like so many did. But I saw my men, boys, really. I chose to live. To let them live. I thought it was cowardice." Gallery looked at him, then out toward the horizon. "Sometimes courage doesn't look like dying for your country," he said. "Sometimes it looks like disobeying for the right reason." When the ceremony ended, they parted like old friends. Gallery kept one photograph from that day, the two of them standing in front of the submarine, smiling faintly, the past finally at rest. In the years that followed, Gallery would tell visitors that moment was worth every risk, every threat of court-martial, every sleepless night. Because in that handshake, the war finally ended. The steel hull behind them gleamed under the city lights, silent now but alive with memory. The boat that had once prowled the Atlantic as a weapon was now a bridge, between enemies, between generations, between destruction and understanding. The museum closed its doors that night with the sound of footsteps fading and the echo of Gallery's words lingering in the air. The story of U-505 was not over. It had simply changed shape, becoming something larger than either man could have imagined. After the reunion in Chicago, the years moved quietly. The Cold War had replaced the great battles of the Atlantic, and most people forgot about the submarine that once refused to die. But Admiral Gallery could not forget. Every time he visited the Museum of Science and Industry, he noticed the rust creeping along the hull of U-505. The paint blistered, the metal pitted, the deck plates corroded by Chicago's rain and snow. The war hero had become a relic exposed to the elements, and the idea of her sinking a second time, this time into history, filled Gallery with dread. By 1953, the Navy had made its decision. The submarine was obsolete, stripped of valuable parts, and sitting at Portsmouth Naval Yard. Their plan was simple: use her for target practice until she sank. It would be efficient, tidy, and final. When Gallery heard, he slammed the telegram down on his desk. "Over my dead body," he said. Within hours, he was on the phone with his brother, Father John Gallery, a Catholic priest with a talent for persuasion and a long list of friends in Chicago's civic circles. Together, the brothers began a campaign to save U-505, not as a weapon, but as a memorial. Father John called the president of the Museum of Science and Industry, a man named Lennox Lore, and laid out an audacious proposal. "Let's bring the submarine to Chicago," he said. "Let's make her a monument to courage and ingenuity, to the Americans who captured her and the Germans who survived her." Lore hesitated. The cost alone could sink the idea. Moving an 800-ton submarine halfway across the continent was nearly impossible. The St. Lawrence Seaway wasn't yet open, and the canals to the Great Lakes were too narrow and shallow for such a vessel. The only route would be a 3,000-mile journey, down the Atlantic coast, through the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi River, and into Lake Michigan. Engineers called it madness. But the city of Chicago had a stubborn heart. When the plan was announced publicly, the response was overwhelming. Schoolchildren sent nickels and dimes in envelopes marked, "Save the Sub." Labor unions offered free manpower. Shipbuilders volunteered equipment. Even corporations pledged donations, eager to attach their names to an act of preservation that defied logic and gravity alike. By spring of 1954, the operation was underway. The Navy released the submarine to the museum, and the tugboats began their journey. Along the East Coast, crowds gathered at every port. In Norfolk, in Charleston, in New Orleans, people lined the docks to watch the captured German submarine pass by, draped in American flags. Veterans saluted. Children waved. Some Germans who had immigrated to the U.S. stood in silence, uncertain whether to cheer or bow their heads. As the convoy entered the Mississippi, the old boat seemed to come alive again. Her engines were dead, but her story moved through the heart of the country she had once been built to destroy. By the time she reached Chicago, over 100,000 people had gathered along the shore to welcome her home. The engineers faced their greatest challenge next: how to move the submarine across land into the museum grounds. Streets were closed, power lines dismantled, and entire sections of parkway dug up to lay temporary rails. The final approach took days. Gallery stood nearby the whole time, refusing to leave until the job was done. When the submarine finally rested in her trench beside Lake Michigan, the crowd erupted in applause. She was home, not as a weapon of war, but as a teacher of peace. Still, restoration remained. The interior had been gutted by years of neglect, stripped by souvenir hunters and scavengers. Gallery had one last idea. He wrote letters to the German companies that had originally built U-505. To Zeiss, to Siemens, to EG, to MAN Diesel. His message was simple and disarming. We have your submarine. It will be displayed for millions to see. Would you like it to represent German engineering at its best, or as an empty shell? The responses astonished him. One by one, the companies agreed to help, not just with blueprints and manuals, but with actual parts. Zeiss sent new periscope lenses. Siemens shipped electrical fittings. MAN Diesel provided specifications to rebuild the engines. None charged a single mark. Many letters ended the same way: if she must remain, let her show the best of us, not the worst. By 1954's end, U-505 gleamed once more. Her deck guns were polished, her interior restored, her periscope bright and functional. She opened to the public that fall, drawing thousands of visitors. Children climbed through the narrow corridors where American sailors once feared the ticking of bombs. Veterans traced their fingers along the cold metal and whispered memories to their grandchildren. Admiral Gallery watched it all, a quiet satisfaction on his face. The submarine that had once defied death now defied time. When reporters asked why he fought so hard to save an enemy vessel, he simply smiled and said, "Because she's more than a submarine. She's a story about courage, on both sides of the periscope." As night fell over Chicago, the lights from the museum glinted off the curved hull of U-505. The city's hum replaced the sound of the sea. The boat that had once hunted in darkness now slept under the glow of street lamps, a silent monument to defiance, ingenuity, and the strange peace that comes when enemies learn to remember together.